This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey there, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 184 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. So to catch you up, in the month of September, as part of a partnership that the B Podcast Network did with Reading is Fundamental, I published extra episodes relating to literacy. The purpose of the campaign is to support literacy, evidence-based practices, as well as book equity. So as I said, in the month of September, I published some extra episodes. And so what I'm doing in October is doing some extra commentary on some of those episodes to share my reflections and some additional insights relating to some of the things that were shared in those interviews. Our partner for that series was Reading is Fundamental, which is a nonprofit that focuses on connecting educators and families with materials and training aligned with evidence-based literacy instruction. Not only is their model aligned with the science of reading, but they also offer unique book ownership solutions for professionals and families to address book equity issues. You can learn more about Reading is Fundamental by taking a look at the links in the show notes. You can also learn more about other B Podcast Network shows at bpodcast.network. One final thing I wanted to mention as part of this special event is that I am offering 25% off when you join either Language Therapy Advance or the School of Clinical Leadership between September 15th and October 15th. The School of Clinical Leadership is my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about that program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations at drkarendspeech.com/language therapy. You can get 25% off either program or both programs when you join between September 15th and October 15th. All you need to do to get that special rate is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page. Now let's get to the commentary. In this episode, I'm discussing my episode with Tom Pardon, Are We Allowed to Say Dyslexia in the Schools?, which is episode 178, as well as episode 179, Increasing Book Equity and Fostering a Love of Reading with Susan Brady. I will start with a discussion on dyslexia. So as I discussed with Tom, in 2015, the Office of Special Education Programs published a letter stating that school teams were not prohibited from using the term dyslexia. We got into a great discussion about what is required versus permitted. And really where we landed was that we both agreed that the more specific you can get about a diagnosis, the better. It gets a little bit confusing when it comes to school teams because many times the eligibility category that your school might use might be specific learning disability. So in theory, a school could be providing a free and appropriate education, even if they haven't designated that a student has dyslexia. That being said, there are specific characteristics and interventions that are known to support students with dyslexia. So our stance is that you can absolutely use the term dyslexia in your documentation in the schools. Now, do you have to do it in order to provide appropriate services? And will using this term guarantee that appropriate services are provided? No, they won't. We still need to make sure that school staff are trained. We still need to make sure that staff have access to resources, professional development, and also that the school is on board with evidence-based literacy instruction, which means there needs to be clear alignment with the curriculum. As someone who has supported practitioners in the schools all over the United States, I know how difficult it can be when you are the one providing the supplemental intervention that's designed to be delivered on top of a robust curriculum, and a robust curriculum is not being provided. Ideally, things like language therapy, any other support services, they need to be high quality, obviously. But if students are not getting high quality reading instruction at the tier 1 level, at the tier 2 level, then it's going to be really difficult for people who are getting students at the tier 3 level and beyond, like SLPs, social workers, psychologists, special ed teachers, really anyone else on that special education team. It's going to be difficult for them to fix a tier 1 problem if they're not getting students until they are being referred for a special ed evaluation. So that's why I think that in that related service provider role, it is very important that you're advocating for your coworkers and your district to be providing training specific to dyslexia and some of those other disability categories so that we know that it's not just a special ed issue, which I think is a really interesting point that Tom brought up in the interview. I know that many people who are pushing for the term dyslexia to be used are doing it because they want to make sure that kids get access to high quality education. And many parent advocates are really pushing for this as well. I've noticed saying, schools have to identify this term, they have to identify dyslexia, which isn't technically accurate. What schools need to do is provide a free and appropriate education. They need to identify students in need of services and provide appropriate services. It doesn't specify in the fine print how that always needs to play out, even though there are specific guidelines. So saying that schools have to diagnose dyslexia isn't entirely accurate, so that can make it difficult for parents. But the other unintended consequence of using that term, as Tom pointed out, is that sometimes people in general education, when you're identifying a specific category like dyslexia, sometimes they think that something is a special education problem and not something that falls on their plate, when in reality, that's not necessarily true. So I think we need to be aware when we advocate for things like disability categories to be identified. We need to understand all of the downstream impacts. Now, I'm not saying that it's okay for people to say, well, if a student has dyslexia, that's a special ed problem. Obviously, we need to educate on that as well. But I think that when we are pushing for different advocacy efforts, we have to understand the impact that we're making, because that really, as I discussed with Tom, helps us to figure out which battles are worth fighting. Because sometimes what we think might be helpful isn't always as helpful as we imagine. And there might be another way to get what we're all trying to accomplish, which is really high quality services for students. The second thing that I wanted to pull out from my conversation with Tom is about the use of technology. Now, there are many strong feelings about technology, which is a huge, broad category. When I went to get my doctorate in special education, I also got a postgraduate certificate in assistive technology so that I would be able to do program evaluations for districts to assist with their assistive technology needs and make recommendations, as well as do assistive technology evaluations for students getting services. So as an SLP, the primary thing that I was thinking about initially with assistive technology would be augmentative and alternative communication, but there are many other types of assistive technology that we might want to consider. So, and this is where I think that it's very important to first define what we mean when we're saying technology, instructional technology, assistive technology, etc. So I'll start with assistive and instructional technology. So instructional technology would be any type of technology that is assisting in learning. So it might not be required for students to learn, but it could benefit for them. There are many supports available for students that are a nice to have, not necessarily a need to have, but they're certainly a great option for teachers to provide in order to offer universal access to supports in their classroom and make things structured but flexible at the same time, just to help students understand what kind of things might be useful to them as they're learning. So again, even things like screen readers, things like speech to text, anything like that could be considered instructional technology if it's a nice to have. Now, assistive technology would be any type of technology that students need in order to access the curriculum. So with assistive technology, it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. If you've done an assistive technology evaluation and you've identified that students need certain assistive technologies and supports as part of their accommodations on their IEP, then they need to have access to those supports. So the same technology could be instructional for one student and assistive for another, and that one student benefits from having it, and another student needs to have it in order to adequately access their education. So that terminology is important. But I also wanted to define, what do we mean by technology? Again, when I went through my coursework in assistive technology, we defined it as technology is really any tool that you use outside of your body to do something. So a lot of times when we think technology, we think high tech, we think a device, an iPad, something, super fancy and very technical, but really Post-it notes are technically assistive technology because they are a tool that you can use to fill a certain purpose. I think an example that many SLPs would be familiar with would be a low-tech AAC system. So using something pretty, again, low-tech, like picture symbols, which again, students can have access to, and then all the way up to a high-tech voice output device. So that's an example of how we have this continuum of technology. Things that are actually very simple can serve as technology. So I wanted to throw that out there because a lot of times when people push back on technology, it's because they're thinking of only high tech, but we actually want students to have access to tools. So yes, technology is something that we want to incorporate into our teaching and our therapy. It's very important because it helps students to have tools and strategies. But as I have said before in a lot of my discussions on executive functioning, for example, a tool is not a strategy. We still need to teach students the skills in order to access tools. One of the challenges and really problems that comes about with executive functioning, for example, is that students are given tools like planners, but not shown how to use their executive functioning skills to use the planner successfully. So I have said in some of my trainings, a planner is not an executive functioning strategy. It is what we use effectively when we're already engaging in effective executive functioning. And I have also said that executive functioning is more than checklists and planners, and that a lot of students who have challenges with executive functioning are not successful when you give them a planner or a checklist. And people think that I'm saying we should never give students those tools, which is not what I'm saying at all. What I'm actually suggesting is that we can pull in tools, but we need to understand that the tool is not the intervention. It's simply a mechanism for helping us teach a student a strategy. And what I'm getting at here is that if students don't have the underlying skills to use technology, they're not going to be successful using it. So I gave a couple executive functioning examples, but I wanted to reference the conversation that I had with Tom in episode 178, because what he mentioned was that many times we utilize technologies for reading, and we don't give students the adequate skills in order to use those technologies successfully. And many times people will say, well, when we get into secondary school, we're reading to learn, not learning to read. And students can access their social studies curriculum, for example, by simply getting a screen reader or utilizing speech to text. They can just dictate verbally what they're writing. But the problem with that is that you need adequate word decoding skills in order to leverage those tools. And Tom gives some great examples in the interview of how you need some word decoding skills in order to get in the ballpark and to be able to evaluate and use the literacy skills you do have when you are accessing tools like spell checker, for example. If you've ever been typing in a Microsoft Word document and you see the little squiggly lines below a word because it's spelled incorrectly, you have to at least be in the ballpark. And when you hover over it and you see the options, you have to be able to read the word and see if the option they're giving is the word that you were trying to type in the first place. So this is just another example in addition to the examples that Tom gave, but the primary thing is that we cannot give up on word decoding in secondary school because many students will not be able to leverage those assistive technologies if we give up on these skills. And we know that when students get adequate instruction, they are able to make progress. And if we're thinking about students being successful in vocational settings, in college, if that's what they choose to do after high school, we have to be considering these things. And if we give up on word decoding, essentially what we're doing is significantly limiting the options that students have after high school. So again, that's episode 178. Are we allowed to say dyslexia in the schools with Tom Pardon? Definitely check it out. Now I wanted to move on to my conversation with Susan Brady about book equity. This is an important conversation because I know that in many of my episodes, I focus on specific tactical things. So what are the strategies that we should do when we have students in front of us? Part of the conversation is, well, what should schools be doing to support students reading? What is this partnership between parents and schools? What does that look like? And I've seen that in a lot of the conversations, there's a lot of finger pointing and kind of shifting of who's responsible for what. And yes, of course, I think we'd all agree that the ideal situation is that there is a shared partnership between the schools and the families. I wanted to reference a specific episode with Dr. Pamela Snow, episode 158, and also an article that she wrote. I will link to these things in the show notes about schools needing additional accountability when it comes to reading instruction. And here's why. If I am a school administrator and I am thinking about how can I guide my staff in making good decisions about curriculum, I have to consider the student body and the needs of all the students in the area that I'm serving. And this homework conversation comes into play here as well, because there's really two questions when we consider whether or not thinking about homework is beneficial. When we're talking about homework, we're really asking the question of, will students make adequate progress in the skills that they need if they're not doing any schoolwork outside of school? So that's really the question that we're asking if we're deciding, should students be getting homework? And really, there are two parts to that question because it depends on your perspective. There's the school leader perspective. And I would say under the school leader perspective, there's all of the other people that the school leaders are supporting, the teachers, the therapists, everyone who is working with the students. And then there is the family perspective and considering what they're able to do for their children. So I will talk about the school leader perspective first. So if I am a school administrator and I am considering what are the needs of my student body and how can I make sure that students get the support, and I'll use reading as an example here. How can I increase the chances that my student body will get access to high quality reading instruction? Well, if I am in that situation, I cannot assume what is going to happen when students leave the school campus. So, as a leader, I have to do as much as I can to ensure that they get what they need when they are at school. So that means if leaders put their money on students doing work outside of school in order to make adequate progress, they're actually setting themselves up for huge equity issues because it's very difficult to control in many cases what students do once they leave school. So, as a school administrator, I have to be making decisions about curriculum with the assumption that students are going to do nothing outside of school when it comes to schoolwork. And yes, it is actually very difficult to even control what happens when you're trying to lead that many people, but at least there is a way and a method for trying to take steps to do it. It's a completely different question if a parent is asking the question, should my students do some type of reading or literacy activities outside of school? Because in that situation, the parent is saying, I am willing and able to provide these activities for my children. Is it beneficial for me to do this? Yes or no? So that's a completely different type of homework question than should schools assign homework to everyone, or should schools rely on homework as one of their tools for teaching students the skills that they need. So if you're a parent and you have the ability and you're wanting to learn more about how you can help your kids, then of course, yes, it makes sense to engage in activities that are going to support your children's literacy skills. So when I make recommendations about what parents can be doing at home, it's not under the assumption that I think everyone has to be doing these things or that schools should require these things to be done. Now, I think that schools can make suggestions and recommendations and provide supports and resources for families to try to make it more likely that families will be able to engage in those activities. But as someone who might be making direct recommendations to a family, that's completely different because I know in that situation that family member is wanting something, is asking for something specific. And so that is why, in that context, I would say, yes, it is a good idea to read for 20 minutes a day with your kids. So, bringing it back to what I discussed with Susan Brady, we had a whole conversation about how can we support literacy? How can we create a culture of reading? And most importantly, what can we do for those families that don't have access to books? I know that while we can control for certain things, we can control for what we do when we have students in front of us. If we're in a leadership position, we have an impact on the curriculum that is done in our building. But what can we do for those things that are more difficult to control if we feel compelled to do so? What can we do for those students who maybe don't have access to those resources? Well, in the conversation with Susan, we discuss some potential things that you can do if you know that your students have a varying range of experiences once they leave your building. One of those things that is really impactful is book distribution. One of the biggest challenges is that sometimes schools or families just don't have a lot of books available to them. And schools, if they need access to materials, it can be difficult to keep track of books. So, Susan shares some great resources for teachers, school staff, families, where you can get tons of high quality free books. So this can make a big impact if you're wanting to do something above and beyond your direct instruction or intervention, if you want to support your community, if you want to have a great pool of resources so that you could, in theory, just give books away to your students and not have to worry about whether or not they bring them back because you already have a lot of other books and resources to use, then I highly recommend checking out the episode because she mentions some great options for where you can get access to those free books. So those are things that you can share with other colleagues. There are things that you can share with your families that you're working with. And there are things that you can utilize yourself, just if you want to create your own library. So highly recommend it. I think the book distribution conversation is something that's very important for the equity piece because, again, there are things that we can't control, but there are steps you can take despite that. And another thing that I discussed with Susan is how she has started some book clubs. We discuss some of those logistical and transportation issues and what she needed to do to start the club and how she handles it. So great conversation there. Again, episode 179 with Susan Brady, where we discuss fostering a love of reading and increasing book distribution. Before I wrap up, I wanted to remind you that there is still time to get 25% off Language Therapy Advanced Foundations or the School of Clinical Leadership if you are in a position to be providing that supplemental literacy intervention. Then you'll definitely want to check out Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. So if you are doing read alouds with your students, if you are providing that supplemental intervention for language and you want to know how to explicitly support elements of vocabulary that are going to build your students' foundation for supporting that comprehension and also giving them those language skills that they need to support those word decoding skills as well. In Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, we get into all of that. It is specifically designed for SLPs who want a framework for language therapy, but other professionals supporting language are welcome to check it out as well. You can learn more about the program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy and enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page to get that special rate. And then another conversation to be had. While in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, I focus specifically on that supplemental intervention. What some people realize when they get clarity around their direct intervention for language and literacy is that they realize they now have tools and strategies at their disposal that they can use to start coaching and training other people. And this is very important if we want to take those skills that we've learned for supporting language and literacy and start thinking more directly about executive functioning. Now, as I've said before, good language therapy embeds lots of executive functioning work into it. That's how I teach in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. The strategies have a lot of self-talk and strategic planning elements worked in. So you are working on executive functioning when you are doing language therapy. But when we're thinking about really making an impact, when you get to the point where you feel really solid in your direct intervention and you're ready to start thinking about other service delivery models, here's where we can make a big impact on executive functioning. One of the biggest pain points that I hear from clinicians when it comes to executive functioning, so this would be things like, again, that time perception, the planning, the organization, the self-regulation, and social skills. I know a lot of people don't realize it, but social skills are an executive functioning skill because of the amount of self-regulation, perspective taking, and the ability to just read situations in the moment and respond and evaluate. So all of that is executive functioning. And as you probably know, if you are just working on direct intervention and you're not utilizing other service delivery models to ensure students get support across the day, if you're not coaching and collaborating with others on your team, it's really difficult to help students get what they need. And as I discussed before, it is very difficult to solve a tier 1 problem if you're only focusing on tier 3. So as a related service provider, if you are a speech pathologist, social worker, psychologist, occupational therapist, maybe even if you're a special ed teacher who does a hybrid where you've got some students in small groups and you're doing some co-teaching and collaboration, you know that if there are challenges at the tier 1 level, if the general education teachers don't have the knowledge and training and support to deliver those universal supports in their classroom, if they're not sure how to model self-talk, and some of those other elements that can support language and cognition, then it gets really difficult to be effective by the time students are getting to that point that they're having a special ed referral. Not to mention that many times there are accommodations that your students with IEPs might need that could probably be beneficial to a lot of students and maybe, again, be offered as necessary accommodations for some, but optional accommodations for others in the classroom. Going back to the conversation of instructional versus assistive technology and thinking about universal design. This is something that's really important, but is not easy to do if you don't have a strategic plan. That's why in the School of Clinical Leadership, I give you specific interventions that you can do directly with your students, but also show you how to develop that strategic plan for getting your other team members on board and getting some of these supports put in place across all of the people who are supporting your students. And I show you how to do it one step at a time. So to learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. So before I wrap up, I just wanted to remind you to check the show notes for links to everything that I mentioned in this episode 178 with Tom Pardon, where we discuss dyslexia and technology, episode 179 with Susan Brady, where we discuss book distribution and fostering a love of reading, the episode with Pamela Snow, as well as her article about how leaders should make decisions about reading curriculum, Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, the School of Clinical Leadership, the B Podcast Network, and finally, our partners for the National Literacy Month campaign, Reading is Fundamental. You can get 25% off either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations as part of the Reading is Fundamental series when you join either program, or actually you could join both programs if you want to, between September 15th and October 15th. All you need to do to get 25% off of either program or both programs is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you sign up. Here's what you can do right now to support the Reading is Fundamental campaign and this special series that we're doing on De Facto Leaders. First, you can go to Apple or Spotify or any other directory you use for podcasts and subscribe to the De Facto Leaders podcast. Once you listen to an episode or two, leave me a rating and review because that helps get my show into the hands of people who need the information. Finally, if you have a colleague or friend who needs to learn more about the research surrounding language and literacy, or you want to spread the word about practices and ideas you'd like to see in your school, community, or state, then tell them about De Facto Leaders so they can listen to all of the episodes in this special series. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.